The PS1 had a lot of games that weren't so great, and sure, some of the games deserve the hate they got, but others were actually kind of fun. So in this episode of the Big Retro Show, I'm going to be giving some of these so-called bad games a second look. It's easy to write off Countdown Vampires as just another Resident Evil clone. After all, it does make heavy use of everything that made RE1 so great. But to call it a bad game is a stretch. Countdown Vampires isn't the greatest game on the PS1, but it's far from the worst. The game takes place inside Casino City on the eve of a grand opening party for the Desert Moon, a new hotel casino with a horror theme. You play as a cop named Keith J. Snyder, who just happens to be doing some moonlighting as a bodyguard when a fire breaks out and a mysterious black liquid sprays partygoers and turns them into vampires. The story is a little out there, but just go with it. Armed with a tranquilizer gun and some holy water, which the game calls white water, you must find the exit to the nightclub before a lockdown is initiated. Find the VIPs and open doors throughout the casino to make your way out. Blocking your way, of course, are newly turned vampires which attack you at every turn. The game's tank controls, pre-rendered backgrounds, graphics, and yes, even bad voice acting are ripped straight out of RE1, and people who are familiar with that game will feel right at home. But therein lies most of the game's criticism, is that it borrows heavily from RE1 but adds nothing new to the genre. One reviewer even called it a poor man's Resident Evil. But hey, even cheap pizza is good, am I right? And this game should be considered much in the same way. The game's plot is fairly simple and the gameplay is very much like RE1, with a few notable differences. The biggest difference, of course, are the vampires themselves. They move a lot like zombies do in Resident Evil 1. But your goal is to try to save them by putting them to sleep with your tranquilizer gun and purifying them with your unlimited supply of white water. The vampires themselves are freaking bullet sponges, so you will have to pump several rounds of the tranquilizer before they go down. If you don't want to bother with rescuing them, you can just shoot them with your 9mm handgun or other weapons you find, such as a shotgun, and send them to their doom. The game lets you arm yourself with 2 weapons at a time and lets you switch them out on the fly. The game also lets you do a 180-degree turn that wasn't available in RE1, and we didn't see that until later sequels. The game does have music and sound effects, but I found the music to be repetitive and turned it off. I like playing these games quietly anyways, as it adds to the creepiness. The game does feature some cutscenes, and I got a good laugh at the voice acting and overall cheesiness of the production.
It's okay. I'm a police officer. Snyder. Keith J. Snyder.
Oh, police officer?
Aside from those differences, it's pretty much an RE1 clone. You'll be finding keycards to open different doors, running past vampires to conserve ammo, and gathering items you will need to aid you in your mission. Again, this game is pretty much a clone of RE1's gameplay, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, and people who like that game, and there are tons of us, will also like this game too. Give it a go! C, the Contra Adventure, is a weird name for a Contra game, but perhaps it's fitting because this game sure is a weird one in the series. To start, the game teases you by starting you off much like you do in the other 2D Contra games. The majority of the game will be played in a third-person perspective, and those famous overhead scenes we saw in games like Super Seed. It's sort of a bummer because the 2D side-scrolling is actually a lot of fun. But does this game deserve to be the red-headed stepchild of the Contra franchise? Maybe not. It still has some Contra charm. Everything you love about Contra is in this game. From the weapons like the spread gun to the zany bosses you fight, it's all here. The one thing that isn't here that is much appreciated are the one-hit deaths. I hate those. The other thing that's really not available is a 2-player co-op mode. For a game that made its bones in the arcade as one of the greatest arcade co-op games in the arcades and on the NES, this seems like a no-brainer. But not to Appaloosa, the game's developers. The game also received a lot of hate for poor controls, lackluster graphics, and an uninspired level design. And while I do agree that the game's controls could have been more polished, I don't agree with the critics' take on the level design and graphics, especially in an era where everything is trying to have that retro look. And this game did have that retro PS1 look that is signature of the system. The other gripe that I have with this game is its platforming, especially in the 3D levels. It can be quite challenging landing on the different platforms and can be frustrating. I found the enemies in this game to be fun to fight, especially since they can't kill you with one hit, but the aiming mechanism in the 3D levels makes it harder than it should be to hit them. The L1 and L2 buttons let you aim the weapon up and down. It's really wonky. The R1 and R2 buttons let you strafe, and that's going to get you out of a lot of trouble. The other buttons allow for the use of a smart bomb and the swapping of weapons, which is much appreciated. I mean, overall there's nothing that we haven't seen before in this game, but I still had fun playing it, and experimenting with the newer weapons like this gun that launches shrapnel. Overall, this game isn't as bad as the critics want you to believe, and I highly suggest you play it, just for kicks. Hey, who doesn't love a good Contra game? Or even a mediocre one. There's one so many times that a dude can die before he rage quits on a game, and back in the day, Mortal Kombat Mythologies was one that did that for me. I remember owning this game when it came out and never making it past the second level due to its brutal platforming and unforgiving level design. There's still something about being the moody ninja Sub-Zero that has always appealed to me, even in the Mortal Kombat games. But everyone going into Mythologies expecting a regular old Mortal Kombat game are in for a rude awakening. In fact, this game isn't a one-on-one fighting game as you would expect with an MK name, but the name and the characters are where the similarities end. You play as a badass ninja Sub-Zero and it's your job to find an amulet of an elder god, Chinook or something. I don't know. The story is long and convoluted and I won't go into it here because it really doesn't matter in a game like this. The movesets are somewhat similar to those that Sub-Zero is known for in the MK games, but you don't get to use them from the beginning. You must gain experience points to level Sub-Zero up, and once you do, you are granted the different moves. Okay, it's not a big deal. I can level up just fine. The combo system introduced in Mortal Kombat 3 stand in this game, and they are satisfying to pull off when you can. The way that you face enemies is a little cumbersome. You must push one of the shoulder buttons to face left or right, and at first this can be cumbersome, but no big deal once you get used to it. You gain experience points by defeating the enemies in this game, but they are rather scarce. The game has a lot of platforming and puzzle solving. There's also a hefty bit of item hunting and backtracking, and it may put people off to this title. Of course, it helps to really love the Mortal Kombat games when playing Mythologies, because the game is downright brutal. The level design requires precise jumps and timing can be crucial. Of course, it's no big deal to people who are gluttons for punishment, but it's the main reason why most people hate this game. I mean, there are tons of cheap deaths in this game that really piss me off. Still, I can't put the game down as I know I just need one more try to land the jump. I for one found it to be fun until I died so many damn times that I rage quit on it. In fact, during this playthrough, I got farther than I ever had in this game and I was quite impressed with myself. The game grants you continues and a bevy of lives. There are power-ups sprinkled through the stages that grant you extra lives and items that will give you health. It's also weird playing an MK game that will let you replenish your health, but trust me, this comes in handy especially with the game's difficulty. The game's graphics and sounds are rather dark and moody and fitting of the Mortal Kombat name. I liked them back in the day and still do today. Is this a banger of a game? Certainly not. It has issues with platforming, cheap deaths, and level design, but overall I had my fun with it and it's worthy of playing, especially if you love Mortal Kombat. The impact that the original Resident Evil had on the PS1 and the gaming industry cannot be understated. Taking it out from that blockbuster is the Planet of the Apes. And while it doesn't quite hit its mark, mainly due to its poor controls and slow pacing, the game does have its charms. But man oh man, the critics dislike this game.
For this war against the apes is lost. Is lost. Is lost.
They did make a lot of sense, but I found out for myself what they were talking about, as I normally do. Planet of the Apes is a third-person, part survivor horror, part stealth game that forces you to stretch to the limits of your imagination to solve some of the game's crazy puzzles. Now, while I did enjoy the classic movie starring Charlton Heston and the later big screen remakes, I've never been a huge fan of the IP, but I didn't let that get in the way of my enjoyment of the game.
And more stupid than a panicked baboon.
In the PS1 edition of Planet of the Apes, you play as a scientist who is exploring the planet with your colleagues when you are attacked and subsequently captured by the superior apes. You are imprisoned and must break out of captivity and basically survive the Planet of the Apes. It's a lot easier said than done. All throughout your playthrough, you will be battling wonky controls, bad camera angles, and a sense of solitude that will make you question why you are playing this game in the first place. The controls. Oh boy, are those controls a doozy. To arm yourself with a weapon, you must first select it by pressing R1 to get into your inventory and then setting the weapon. The triangle button will arm you with your weapon when you need it and put it away when you don't. It's a totally unnecessary game mechanic that could have freed up a button to use for jumping. Speaking of which, to jump you must first push the run button, which is R2, then press the action / swing your weapon / use your medkits button, designated as X. It's completely crazy. To run, you can push R2, and you can also crouch by pressing the L2 button, and L1 is not used. It's a missed opportunity and really could have made this game a lot better. The camera angle is also hampered by the clunky way your character walks. The tank-like controls and sluggish movements make this game a bit more frustrating than it needs to be. The combat in this game is really rather mindless. You just mash your attack button while your ape adversary blocks, and if you mash fast enough, he won't get a lick in, but instead your hit will land. The stealth mechanics in this game really don't work either, given that you can't walk up behind an ape and then take them out silently. The weapons in this game are of the club, knife, and gun variety, and all the combat was lacking, but you know it really doesn't matter because the enemies are so scarce in all the levels that you will hardly be in danger. For a planet that's supposed to be full of apes, there are only a few sprinkled throughout the levels. At most, I probably fought like 4 of them in any given stage. It's not a bad thing, but the levels can get quite lonely, and you will be doing a lot of running around in silence or with very little music to try and solve some of these crazy puzzles. The puzzles in this game can be quite frustrating. For example, while trying to break out of the medicine ward, you must first learn that the poisons the ape store can either kill you, do nothing, or knock you out temporarily. You must then find the poison, take it, and then ring the alarm to alert the apes that you are basically sick so they can take you away to the next part of the game. Now, I didn't know any of this. I ran around for days trying to figure out what to do. I guess I have no patience because I went online and found a walkthrough for the game and finally figured it out. I have zero shame. These old games were really tough. Despite its bad controls, lack of enemies, and overall lonely experience, I did have a little fun with this game and can't totally count it out. The game isn't going to win any awards, but I did enjoy beating up the apes here and there and solving some of the puzzles and generally going from cutscene to the next in progression of the story. This is a game that isn't as polished as good old Resident Evil, but fans of the game will find some value in Planet of the Apes, even if it's just to rip on it at parties. Like most of the games in this episode, Star Wars Demolition is a game that grew on me. I've always liked the Twisted Metal games going back to the PS1, and Star Wars Demolition is essentially a Twisted Metal experience set in the Star Wars universe. I can see why fans of the Star Wars universe didn't like this game though. You get no classic scenes from the game to battle in, other than some arenas set in popular Star Wars locales. The choice of your vehicles may seem familiar, but the characters driving them are questionable. Also, how come Boba Fett isn't in the Slave 1? It seemed like a missed opportunity in my book. At any rate, in Star Wars Demolition, you will be fighting in a series of arena-style battles where it's you against, well, basically everyone else. The name of this game is Surviving, and to do that you will need to pick up a bevy of power-ups, such as proton torpedoes, thermal detonators, tractor beams, and well, you get the point. Of course, each vehicle has their own strengths and weaknesses, and their own top speed, armor rating, and special weapon power. While the special weapons can be fun to use against your enemies, some of them make no sense. Like this towing cable? Okay, not all of your enemies are going to be Imperial Walkers, so put the cable away. The game also has droids sprinkled throughout that will upgrade your firepower and repair your armor. The game forces you to charge your weapons, which I thought was a bit cumbersome and breaks the flow of the combat. At the same time, your ship loses weapon power that you must refill, just so that your standard weapons will have an effect. It's crazy, but it does force you to strategize. Do you take on an enemy with everything you have left? Or do you recharge your weapons, your shields, grab a power-up, and charge your attacks, and then go after them? For the most part, I played this game recklessly and stupidly, as I tend to play arcade games like this. I don't want to think about getting in a car and trying to take the fools out, I just want to do it. And that's probably the biggest problem with this game, there's too much charging going on. But that being said, taking out your opponents is super satisfying and why I continue to play this game. After you get the hang of the charging mechanics for your shields, weapon power, and weapon damage level, you start winning. Of course, this game doesn't let up on you and you will face stronger enemies the deeper you get into the tournament rounds. The game has several modes, including high stakes mode, where you can make bets on the rounds with the money you have earned. The money is important because you get to unlock different racers to fight with. Of course, it's a slog and you have to grind through the tournament to get enough credits for anyone good. Star Wars Demolition isn't going to win any awards or anything like that, but if you are a fan of vehicle combat games and a fan of Star Wars, then why not? And that's going to be it for the Big Retro Show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, consider subscribing to the channel, dropping a comment, and leaving a like. And I will catch you next time on The Big Retro Show.